Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel, I'm a longtime pro who specializes in the low stakes. So if you're looking to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. Let's take a step back in time to a session I played back in May and dissect it to see if we can learn anything. We'll be playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 1,500, which is 300 big blinds. It's Saturday night on May 25th. Although technically Sunday morning since we don't start until 1:36 in the morning. About 10 minutes into the session, Under the Gun opens for 15 with a stack of about 350. The hijack and button both call. The small blind folds, and I defend the big blind for only 10 more with King 7 of diamonds. The flop comes 8, 10, King with 2 spades and a heart. We flop top pair, but unfortunately our kicker is nothing to write home about. This is the major drawback with playing hands like King 7 out of position in a multi-way pot. We're not really hoping to spike top pair with this sort of hand. So I start with a check, and thankfully the action checks around. There's a good chance we're ahead right now. Unfortunately, the turn brings in a 10 of clubs, pairing middle pair. Now anyone with a 10 has just caught up to take the lead. We're hoping to just get a cheap showdown, so I check again. This time, the Under the Gun original raiser leads with a paltry bet of 15 into the $60 pot. The hijack and button fold, but I decide to stick around for this small price. The river brings in another unwelcome sight in the form of a 9 of diamonds. Hands like Jack Queen and 6-7 make a straight. We don't beat a whole lot on this board, so I check yet again, only to have our opponent slam a massive overbet of 100 into the $90 pot. There are times when you can pick to be a hero if an opponent's line just simply doesn't make sense, but this isn't one of them. He can have a boat here with a hand like pocket 8s. He can have a 10, or simply just Jack Queen for a rivered straight. We don't beat much of anything, so this is just an easy fold. Here, Under the Gun limps. I raise to 15 in the low jack with ace-10 offsuit. Only the small blind and Under the Gun player call. We go 3 ways in position to a flop of 10, 3, 5 with a club and 2 spades. We flop top pair with top kicker on a low board with an obvious spade flush draw, which, in my opinion, is much better than flopping an ace-high board where we will only have top pair with a medium kicker. Small blind checks. Under the Gun leads with a bet of 20 into the pot of 50, which is a less than half pot size bet into a decently wet board, especially considering the multi-way nature of this hand. Flopping top pair with top kicker here is about as good as it gets when you raise with a hand like ace-10 offsuit, so I bump the action up to 80, charging the various weaker 10s as well as the obvious flush draw. The small blind folds, but Under the Gun makes the call. The turn brings in an unsightly Queen of diamonds. This is a great card if we were bluffing with air, but a terrible card to bet here for value against a weaker 10. Either our opponent has just caught up with 2 pairs, or she's going to hate this queen if she had a hand like King 10 or something similar. Our opponent checks. Had this card been something smaller or insignificant, I would have blasted near full pot to charge a disbelieving 10, as well as the various straight and flush draw combinations. But since this queen is not ideal, I bet slightly under half pot for 100 into the pot of 210. The draws are all going to continue for this price tag, obviously, but our aim is to charge a price that might also keep in the various dominated 10s. You always need to keep in mind the hands you're targeting whenever you bet a certain amount. We are no longer at top of range, so we also want to limit the damage in case our opponent actually has Queen 10 and we face a check raise here. We've been demoted to second pair after all, so we're only trying to bet for value at this point. Unfortunately, our price tag is just a tad bit too high for our opponent as she puts in the fold. Never get too upset about winning a pot by betting appropriately though. It's much better than losing a pot because you bet inappropriately. The very next hand, we look down at pocket aces in the middle position. Huzzah! Pocket freaking rockets. I don't have a full grasp of how this table plays yet, whether it's passive or aggressive, so I only open for 20. If I thought this table were aggressive, I would only open for 15 and invite someone to 3-bet me. On the other hand, if I thought this table were passive, like most 1-3 tables for instance, I would open for 25 to fold out most junky hands so you don't have to go multi-way against too many other opponents. So for my $20 raise, everyone else folds, but the big blind makes the call. The flop comes 8, Queen 8, rainbow. We're completely crushing a queen, but we're completely crushed by an 8. Big blind checks. If the flop were more disconnected, like Queen 3-3 for instance, I could see bet incredibly small here to like 15 or 20. But since this is a deep stack game, and the pot is currently so small, a lot of gut shots will continue here for a considerable amount. Hands like 9-10 or 10-jack, and of course no queen is folding here either. So I throw out a pretty strong 3/4 pot size bet of 30 into the pot of 40. Unfazed, big blind makes the call. The turn brings in a 4 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. Our opponent checks again. This 4 shouldn't change a whole lot, but it does introduce a possible backdoor flush draw in case our opponent were randomly holding diamonds to go along with their gut shot or a queen. I fire out another bet of 60 into the pot of 100, which is a 60% pot size bet. Even though this is incrementally a smaller bet with proportion to the pot, meaning my opponent would get better pot odds, it's a larger bet overall than the flop bet, which actually reduces implied odds percentage-wise. My opponent ends up making the fold, so we win a small pot, but it's still much better than getting cracked. A few hands later, the hijack limps. The button raises to 15. The small blind calls. Jack deuce of clubs is a pretty terrible hand, especially in the big blind. But for only $10 more, I get to take this hand multi-way, so I decide on a call, and the hijack calls as well. We go 4 ways to a flop of 4 deuce 5 with a spade and 2 clubs. We flop bottom pair with a jack high flush draw, which is about as good as it gets when you play this sort of hand. We're nearly flipping against even a hand as strong as pocket aces. So when the small blind checks, I leave for 35 into the pot of 60 to potentially take this pot down right here and now. The hijack folds, the button makes the call, and the small blind gets out of the way. The turn brings in a 10 of spades, putting 2 spades on board to go along with the 2 clubs. Okay, so this is where I mess up. I incorrectly assumed that my opponent raised on the button with some sort of overpair to the 5 high flop. Even if this were the case, there's a very good chance that I can get her to fold with increased aggression, as long as I bet strong enough regardless of the overcard on the turn, and even if she does call, we'll still have between 13 to 14 outs to improve by the river. Instead, I chicken out and check, only to have my opponent check the action back. Maybe I had sniffed just a tiny bit too much butt crack that morning. I don't use drugs, so butt crack is about as nasty of a substance as I'm willing to inhale. The river brings in a queen of hearts. Since I played this hand so meekly, I have no choice but to check again. The button now decides to bet, but only for a paltry sum of 35 into the pot of 130. This is such an annoying spot. That's almost certainly a value bet sizing, but the price is simply too good to pass up. Listen to the original audio as I call out my opponent's hand before putting in the call.
I don't think I can fold here. Ace queen is good.
Oh my god, I freaking called it. My opponent does indeed turn over ace queen, so I lose this one. It may be a small pot, but I wanted to point out a couple of things. A massive combo draw, such as a flush draw with a pair, should definitely be played aggressively to maximize fold equity, especially when our opponent hasn't shown strength of any kind. Her pre-flop raise of 15 after 1 limper was pretty weak, and so was her flop call when I only bet half pot. So if I had played my hand correctly and increased my aggression with a pot size bet on the turn, I could have avoided losing this hand. I don't get another playable hand for over half an hour. Here, the table has decided to keep a straddle on permanently. I open to 40 in the low jack with ace queen offsuit. Everyone else folds, but the straddle makes the call. The flop comes deuce, 9, 10 with 2 hearts and a diamond. We don't flop anything at all, except 2 random overs and a couple of backdoor draws. The under the gun checks. I favor checking back 10 high boards in a single raise pot because such a board will usually miss my range, just like it did here, so that's what I do. The turn brings in a jack of spades, improving our hand to include an open-ended draw. The under the gun checks again. I want to utilize some fold equity to potentially take down this pot, so I fire a strong bet of 50 into the pot of 85. Unfortunately, the under the gun player isn't going to let us win that easily as he puts in the call. The river brings in a 4 of clubs. We brick out completely, but that 4 couldn't have done anything for our opponent either. Our opponent checks for a 3rd time. Sure, we do have some showdown value here with our ace high, in case our opponent also missed his draw as well, but what if he had a pair to go along with his draw? What if he's holding a hand like 4-5 of hearts or 8-9 of clubs, for instance? Both of these sorts of hands beat our ace high, but will almost definitely fold to a strong bet. We might even be able to get a weak jack like jack 8 of diamonds or something similar to fold to a strong bet as well. So I shoot out a slight overbet of 200 into the pot of 185. I mean, instead of ace queen here, It's just as possible I could be holding king queen for the nuts. Unfortunately, all of this strategizing flies right out the window when my opponent jams all in for about 500. Whoops. My bad, bro. I got caught with my hand in the cookie jar. I have no choice but to fold, topping off for another 200 and bringing our total buy-in up to 2,000. 2 hands later, I'm in the straddle with king 5 of diamonds. The cutoff limps. Everyone else folds, but when the action swings around to the small blind, he puts in an incredibly weak raise to 25, even though he's out of position and there's already been 1 limper into the pot. The big blind folds. Sure, an argument could be made here to simply call for 15 more, since I do have a decent enough hand. But whenever I smell weakness, I like to try to capitalize on that to take down the pot without a struggle, or at the very least, single out my opponent while in position and kick out the cutoff. So I put in a strong 3-bet to 125. As predicted, the cutoff folds, but my plan fails completely when the small blind puts in a massive 4-bet to 425. This is the same opponent whom I failed to bluff in the last hand. My hands are pretty tied here with king 5, so again I have no choice but to fold. But I make a mental note that I'm dealing with an incredibly unorthodox player. He should never have a strong hand there with such a weak raise in those conditions. Damn, so far none of my plays are working. Maybe I should just take the advice that some people leave in the comments and just give up poker. As usual, there's a live 10 in this hand. I open to 30 on the button with 8-9 offsuit. I will raise with a whole bunch of gobbledygook on the button that I won't even bother limping with in earlier positions. Here, the small blind folds, but the big blind and straddle call. The flop comes 6, 10, 6 with 2 clubs and a diamond. We flop a gut shot draw on a paired board. Both opponents check to me. On small paired boards like this, I like to c-bet small with my entire range to potentially take down the pot without needing to improve. It's very possible that neither of our opponents has anything either. So I throw out a stagnant bet of 30 into the $90 pot. Surprisingly, both opponents make the call. The turn brings in an 8 of spades, improving us to second pair to go along with our gut shot. Once again, both opponents check the action over. We now have a small bit of showdown value, so no point betting here. I'd never get a 10 to fold anyways, so I just check the action back. The river brings in a deuce of diamonds. Everything misses, but we still do maintain second pair. So when the action checks to me for a third time, there's no point betting against any missed draws, and I can't think of any worse hand someone could be holding that would call me for any sort of value bet here, so I just check the action back. Big blind flips over ace king, and the straddle turns over deuce 3 of clubs for a missed flush draw that rivered bottom pair. So we win this one. And this is exactly why ace king is known as a drawing hand and needs to be played aggressively. You'll miss 2 out of 3 flops. That's just the mathematics. Had our opponent 3-bet this hand pre-flop to any rational amount, like to 100 or so, I would have simply folded. 10 minutes later, the cutoff opens to 35. Buckle in, boys and girls, because this one's about to get a little bit spicy. I look down at ace-queen offsuit on the button. Normally, I would 3-bet here the vast majority of the time. However, I don't do anything 100% of the time. This is to throw in a bit of unpredictability to my plays. This is what makes my playstyle incredibly dynamic. Keep in mind that I've been playing at the same casino for most of the past 10 years, and I see a lot of the same faces on a regular basis. I would not be nearly as profitable as I am if my playstyle were stagnant and predictable. So here I only just smooth call. The small blind and big blind call as well. When the straddle suddenly puts in a 3-bet to 140. The cutoff original raiser folds. I think that 140 is actually rather small given the number of players already in the hand, especially considering his non-ideal position being trapped in the middle. I get the impression I'm definitely dealing with a recreational player here. I have the button, and I also underrepped how strong my hand actually is, so I put in the call. The small blind and big blind both call as well, so we go 4 ways to flop of 7, 6 deuce rainbow. We don't flop anything whatsoever except 2 random overcards. Small blind goes all in for his last remaining $23. Yes, he literally stuck in nearly 90% of his stack pre-flop. You may as well just go all in at that point. Even for this super duper tiny bet that's smaller in size than my Asian peepee, especially considering the pot is already just shy of $600, the big blind folds. It's no surprise when the under the gun straddle puts in a raise, but it's not a very considerable one. He bumps the action up to 200. Okay, I know I only have ace-queen, but let's analyze this hand for a moment. I think we're dealing with a recreational player here because his pre-flop sizing is just too small. What do we know about recreational players? On flops where they want to protect their hand, especially in a multi-way pot, they tend to bet incredibly large, usually close to full pot. This raise to only a third pot size bet is a pro move, especially on a dry board. So what's the takeaway from this? I think our opponent is trying to isolate the short stack shove with a timid raise. Are we going to let him get away with it? Heck no! We have position, and we're getting an amazing price to smack one of our random overcards to potentially win this massive pot. And on top of that, I also plan to steal this pretty decently large side pot as soon as the under the gun straddler shows the first sign of weakness, which I suspect he will on the vast majority of turn cards. I really don't think he has anything. So I put in the call. The turn brings in a 3 of diamonds, keeping the board rainbow. As expected, the under the gun player checks. Time to put my plan into action. No need to bet very large here, especially against a hand that I suspect has completely bricked the board, even if he might potentially have us beat right now with a hand like ace-king. So I throw out a modest bet of 325 into the combined pot of 1018. After 30 seconds of fake tanking, the under the gun aggressor puts in the predictable fold. The river brings in a 5 of hearts, which does not in fact improve our hand unfortunately, but it wouldn't have mattered anyways because small blind turns over pocket sixes for a flop set. So it turns out we actually had no chance to win the main pot, but our advanced play still booked us a profit that was slightly more than we invested in the hand, simply because we paid attention to bet sizing. Plus, the small blind shove was only for 23 into the $600 pot. He could literally have anything there. Wouldn't it have been amazing if he flipped over jack or king high or something like that? Alright ladies and gentlemen, get ready for another fun one. Here there's a live 10. It folds around to me on the button where I look down at everyone's favorite hand, pocket jacks. I open to 35. No need to go too crazy since I'm guaranteed position in this hand, and I only have the blinds and the straddle yet to act. The small blind folds, but the big blind and straddle both call. The flop comes 5, 9, 9, rainbow. We maintain an overpair, but medium paired boards when you're holding an overpair can get a little bit dicey. The action checks over to us. On polarized flop like this, without any obvious draws, I generally c-bet small with my entire range. This means I will c-bet on this sort of flop 100% of the time, regardless of what I'm actually holding. Whether it's 2 random overcards, a gut shot straight with a hand like 7-8 suited, trip 9s, or the occasional overpair like what I'm currently holding in this hand. So I throw out a down bet of 30 into the pot of 105. The big blind folds, but under the gun makes the call. The turn brings in a queen of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. We've been reduced to second pair. Under the gun checks for a second time. When deciding on a price point to bet, always keep in mind the sorts of hands you're targeting. I want to keep in a 5 that's drawing pretty close to dead, and also target small pocket pairs like 6s, 7s, or the like. I also want to keep in the flop gut shot draws, and maybe some hands that could have turned a backdoor flush draw. We can't beat a queen, and we obviously can't beat a 9, so I priced this bet on the smaller side, with another very small bet of 50 into the pot of 165, which is less than a third pot size bet. We're not showing very much strength at all, and should be able to keep in a lot of worse hands with a bet of this size. Surprisingly, the under the gun player suddenly wakes up with a check raise to 200. It's 150 more for me to call. So far, this player has been incredibly passive. He's only ever had the goods when it came to showdown. But do you know what I've learned over the years? There are very few players you can completely typecast and expect to remain within the boundaries of their player type. Unless you know a player from multiple sessions, I've seen what I thought were the tightest players have the occasional psychotic breakdown. They capitalize on their tight image and get away with the goofiest plays, since they make them so very rarely. So with that in mind, I can never make this call hoping to spike a random 2-outer on the river. With less than 5% to hit a jack, I would need to win a pot of well over $3,000 to make this call if I think I'm behind. And that's just never going to happen in a million years. So if I make this call, I need to be prepared to also call a river bet as long as the board doesn't change too dramatically. This is a spot where I've seen so many players mess up. They make the correct assessment on the turn, but end up folding to a river bet even after nothing has changed with the board. Don't second guess yourself, and always play with the correct math. If I make this call here, I need to be mentally prepared to not just invest 150 more, but probably closer to 600, factoring a large river bet. Alright, so now let's evaluate. What sort of hands could our opponent be holding here that we have beat? And what could he be holding that has us crushed? Just a naked queen has us beat for sure, but a check raise from a queen here just doesn't make sense. We have much stronger queen combinations than our opponent in the straddle. We could easily be holding king queen or ace queen here, so he's much more likely to just smooth call with any combination of a queen. Obviously, if he has pocket fives or a 9, we're in a lot of trouble. That's why we bet so tiny on the flop. It was intended to get a bigger hand to check raise. It was a bet designed to cap our opponent. We faced no such check raise. Sure, it is possible he could have been slow playing. Okay, so now let's evaluate his turn sizing if that's the case. I bet really tiny on the turn, which means I'm not trying to utilize fold equity. This means I most likely don't have a backdoor flush draw. Either I'm an awful player betting with air, or I most likely have a value hand of some sort. Against pocket fives or a 9, value hands only have between 2 to 4 outs. So if you knew your opponent only had between 2 to 4 outs, would you really check raise the turn this huge? I'm thinking 150 or so would have been more appropriate. A check raise of 200 is the kind of sizing that wants me to fold. Keep in mind all of this analysis is based on a recreational opponent. Pros can use much different non-standard amounts based on their target. I do it all the time as an exploitative player, but taking into consideration my opponent is most likely a recreational, I suspect he's trying to capitalize on his tight image to bluff me here. If nothing else, we can always reassess on the river, so I put in the call. The river brings in a 10 of spades, not changing a whole lot, only gut shots like Jack King and Jack 8 complete. My opponent takes his time before acting. He delays for over 15 seconds in fact, before throwing out a massive bet of 420. I go pretty deep in the tank. I tank for just over 2 minutes. I just want to double check that my thought process on the turn was fully sound. Up until this point in the session, I've been losing. I wasn't aggressive enough in that hand where I flopped a flush draw with a pair, allowing my opponent to spike a free overcard, and then paying off her ace-queen on the river. I was overly aggressive in the hand where I was the one who held ace-queen and got check-jammed on the river after I attempted a $200 bluff. If I lose this hand, I might fly off the deep end into full Tiltsville, and that's a town I really want to avoid visiting. My opponent is sitting across the table from me, so he's too far from my old eyes to make out any noticeable live tells. So now it all boils down to betting patterns and sound logic. That 10 should have bricked all logical draws. I think if my opponent really did have a 9 or pocket 5s here, he would go for a value bet sizing, probably closer to half pot. A professional would definitely bet huge here even with the hand as strong as queen 9, and even the huge raise on the turn with a nutted hand like queen 9 would make sense from a professional. But again, we're ruling out the possibility that our opponent is a professional. So taking into account my opponent's big bet on the turn and his big bet on the river, especially considered I'm weighted towards a lot of very weak hands here, I think my logic is pretty sound. So I make the call. Okay, so before we move on, I've been scrutinized on the channel.
The way you play, you will get absolutely run over by an aggressive player who likes to raise.
This is probably because I fold to a lot of 3-bets pre-flop after I open with some pretty mediocre hands like ace-jack or king-queen. Meh, I may be an old man, but I still have a few tricks in my arsenal to deal with you hooligans. So after I put in the call, my opponent just throws his cards into the muck, and I table my hand to show him just how light we called him with. Alright, making good decisions to finally put us in the green. A few hands later, it's my turn to straddle under the gun. The button opens to 25 with a stack of about 500. The small blind folds, but the big blind calls. I recognize this button open as a pretty weak raise against the blinds. It also helps that I'm holding ace-king in the straddle. Ace-king plays much better aggressively, using proper fold equity to take down pots without seeing a flop. So I 3-bet the action to 125. Both of my opponents quickly fold. Remember that hand earlier when I won because the big blind only just smooth called my tiny button open when I was holding 8-9 offsuit, when they actually had ace-king? This is how my opponent should have played their hand, and they could have just won without a struggle, just like how I did here. For this next hand, the cutoff opens to 30. The button folds, but the small blind calls. Looking down at king-jack offsuit in the big blind, I don't exactly love my position, but I'm only facing a 3x raise considering the straddle, so I make the call, and the straddle calls as well. For informational purposes, had I been facing a 4 or 5x raise, I would have just folded. Now you may be thinking I'm being nitpicky with the extra blind or two, but that actually makes a big difference. Hands that open raise for those amounts usually denote a lot more strength than I'm willing to play for with king-jack offsuit out of position. We go 4 ways to a flop of 10, queen, deuce with 2 hearts and a diamond. We flop an open-ended straight draw with 1 overcard on a board with a possible heart flush draw. I would like my hand a lot more if the flop had been rainbow. I'm willing to call a decent amount on this type of flop, but nothing crazy because this is a multi-way pot and one of our opponents could be on a heart draw while someone else could have a hand like ace-jack or something similar, reducing us to only 6 clean outs. So when the small blind checks, I check as well, and thankfully the action checks through. The turn brings in a beautiful ace of clubs. We bink the absolute nuts in the form of a Broadway straight. Small blind checks again. I'm hoping the cutoff hit that ace. Either that or he'll try to represent it, so I check as well. But unfortunately, the action checks through for a second time. The river brings in a pretty hideous card. It's the ace of hearts. The front door flush draw completes, and the board is also now paired. We've been demoted pretty heavily, but when the small blind checks again, we need to go for a little bit of value. We can't bet too big though because we're nowhere near nutted. Plus no one has shown any interest in this hand so far, so we need to target some pretty weak hand holdings. I shoot out a bet of 50 into the pot of 120, hoping to get a call from a weak ace or possibly a non-believing queen. The cutoff calls, but the other 2 players fold. We table our hand, and it's good. About 10 minutes later, my old table has since broken, so I've been moved to a new 8-handed table. The straddle is no longer on for this table. Here, under the gun opens for 20. I call in the middle position with ace-3 of clubs. The cutoff, small blind, and big blind all call as well. So we go 5-handed to a flop of 9, 10, 4 with 2 clubs and a diamond. We flop the nut flush draw with an ace as an overcard. This is a way above average flop. We're doing pretty good even against a hand like pocket kings. The action checks around to me. I lead with a 3/4 pot size bet of 75 into the $100 pot, hoping to utilize fold equity to potentially take this pot down right here and now. Only the small blind makes the call, so we go heads up in position to a turn, which brings in a gorgeous 8 of clubs, improving us to the nut flush. Small blind checks again. The board is still 10 high, so there are a ton of hands our opponent will still be willing to call with, like a naked 10, 2 pairs, or better yet, a smaller flush or even a straight. So I attempt to entice our opponent by showing false fear, reducing my aggression with a bet of only 100 into the pot of 250. As predicted, my opponent makes the call. The river completes with an insignificant deuce of hearts. We're still holding the absolute nuts. My opponent checks for a 3rd time. Okay, so even though my opponent has played this hand super meek so far, I think he's trying to pot control since the turn was a club, and rightfully so since we did turn the nut flush after all. I don't think a 10 will call for very much on this run out. So instead, let's target hands like Jack Queen or a smaller flush and go for max value. I shoot out a monstrous bet of 425 into the pot of 450. Our opponent doesn't immediately fold, which is always a great sign when you're trying to go for value. Eventually, after almost a full minute in the tank, he does indeed put in the call, so we take down this pretty juicy pot. We don't get involved in any significant hands for almost a full hour. Here the low jack opens for 15. The hijack calls. I call on the button with 5-6 offsuit. In any other position, this completely garbage hand would not even be worth limping with. But as you know, I play all sorts of gobbledygook on the button, especially when facing a 3x raise with another caller trapped in between. That's how powerful I view the button. So the small blind and big blind both end up calling as well. We go 5-handed in position to flop of 7, deuce 8, rainbow. We flop an open-ended straight on a rainbow board, which is a way above average flop. Small blind checks. The big blind leads with a less than half pot size bet of 30 into the $75 pot. The low jack and hijack fold, But with our open-ended draw, I make the call on the button, and the small blind gets out of the way. If I were holding a draw with more equity like 9-10, I would probably go for a hefty raise here instead of just flat calling, hoping to utilize some fold equity. So we go to a turn, which brings in a magnificent 4 of hearts, improving us to the nut straight, while keeping the board deliciously rainbow. Big blind leads again, with another timid bet of 55, once again using a less than half pot size bet. His bet sizing isn't showing very much strength at all, so I suspect he might have some sort of dead draw here with the naked 8. If he were showing more strength, I might raise here to a much more significant amount, but since I suspect my opponent has a dead draw, I only bump the action up to 125, which is still less than a pot size bet. My opponent can't resist the small raise, so he makes the call. The river puts out a very disappointing 5 of clubs. Any 6 makes a straight. Not only is it a scare card, but now we chop with 6-7, 6-8, and we actually lose to 6-9. Still, when our opponent checks, we still need to try to milk out value from weaker hands. Maybe our opponent rivered 2 pairs and he won't be able to fold. Maybe he'll put me on 9-10 and make a hero call. So I fire out a 2/3 pot size bet of 250. Unfortunately, our opponent makes a very quick fold, so we don't get paid. Only a few minutes later, we've lost a couple of players, so we're only 6-handed for this one. Here, there's a live 10. The hijack min raises to 20. After the button folds, I 3-bet to 75 with pocket queens in the small blind. The luscious ladies! The big blind cold calls and the hijack tags along as well. We go 3-handed to flop a 4 Jack-Jack with 2 diamonds and a heart. We maintain an overpair, but we're in pretty bad shape against a jack. On paired boards, I like to bet small with the majority of my hand holdings, so I start with a stagnant c-bet of another 75. Interestingly enough, both opponents make the call. The turn brings in an absolutely gorgeous Queen of Spades. We improve to top full house, losing only very specifically to quad jacks. I want to entice my opponents to continue with everything they're holding, and to potentially even try to get someone to steal the pot if they detect my falsely projected weakness. So I fire out a second bullet for only another laughable 75. This time the big blind folds, but the middle position sticks around. The river brings in a 4 of hearts, double pairing the board. The flush draw has bricked out, and given how meek my opponent has played this hand so far, I doubt he's going to try to steal the pot with the missed draw if I check to him. Otherwise, he probably would have already made an attempt on the flop or turn. I highly doubt he has a jack here though, otherwise we would have heard about it by now. So the reality of the matter is we're most likely not going to get paid with this run out. But there's still a small chance our opponent could have a hand like ace-4 of spades maybe, and he might be willing to make a hero call. So I go for the gold and fire out a toe-curling bet of 500 into the $600 pot. Unfortunately, our opponent makes a pretty quick fold, but we still win a decent-sized pot. I play for another few minutes before the table gets too short for my liking, so I rack up and head to the cage. In for 2,000 and out for 32.61 for a delectable profit of $1,261 after 4 hours of playtime. It sucked being stuck the first 2 hours of this session, with none of my plays working out, but I'm always happy to turn a bad session around. You can't expect to win every single hand. Not all of your bluffs will get through. Not all of your hero calls will be correct. As you can see, I make mistakes all the time. I'm still human. The important thing is being able to push past your mistakes and continually improve your skill. If you guys like what you saw today, remember to smash that like button. Hype this video if you get the option to. Subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em. Follow me on Instagram to find out about my monthly $500 cash raffles and the end of the year $5,000 cash raffle. Check out my Patreon if you want to see more of the coaching series, as well as to get early access to my vlogs. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.